So thanks for coming out. It's the second morning. I think we got a good slot. People are still kind of ready to go and ready to learn. So my name is Ben Edwards. I am a principal research scientist currently at BitSight. I get to give this talk to my friend Ed, who came up with the Ransomware Defense Initiative. So I'm going to give you kind of some background. He's going to tell you all about it. And then I'm going to do some data analysis because that's what I do best. So if you want to move to the next slide. You have probably seen this. This is the disclaimer that says RSA conference doesn't promote any of this. You can read that. I have another disclaimer. I was so excited about this research that I did this independently. This is not part of BitSight, so this is not the reflection of my employer. But I liked the Ransomware Defense Initiative so much that I partnered with Ed in my free time to do this. So that's how good it is. Hopefully you like that. So go back. Before we get into the nuts and bolts, I'm going to ask a really forward question, and I apologize for this because I don't know everybody in the room. How many of you will admit to being a victim of ransomware? Oh, a few. That's very great. Okay, so let's maybe a little bit more general. How many of you know somebody who has been a victim of ransomware? Okay, yeah, quite a few more. So this is anecdotal data, but this is a big problem. It is something where it's easy for attackers to monetize their attack, their breach, through ransomware. And so we should be focused on it, and clearly people are. I've got a full room here, so that's great. So as a data scientist, the first thing I like to do when I'm approaching a new problem is kind of find out what other people are saying about these things. So these are two reports. This is not my work. I'm, of course, referencing other people. But as the kind of informal survey we did, ransomware is a big problem. It's a billion-dollar industry, according to some reports. It is more than just locking up your files, and in fact, making you pay the ransom to unlock them. Data exfiltration, so this is a report from Arete and Scientia that was done, where the ransomware operators will take your data, encrypt it, but also hold it for themselves and say, you have to pay us extra to delete it. Those attacks are increasing, and in fact, the DBIR came out last week. I didn't get a chance to update the slides, but there was this increase in the exfiltration. So this is not just this report saying that, this is also kind of others confirming it. The best in the industry, the DBIR. So billion-dollar industry, this is where attackers are focused because it's easy to monetize. There's lots of gangs out there. I don't know if any of you just saw the keynote, but Miko had essentially the same conclusion. This is something that's growing. Okay, so we know it's a big problem. How big is the scope of the problem for individual organizations? So I'm going to go ahead and talk about other reports again for just a second, and then we'll get into what we have here. So these are again from the Scientia and Arete reports. I'm talking about what the cost for defending against a ransomware attack are. So these are incidents that Arete came in and helped do incident response for ransomware attacks. And they're really heavy-tailed. So what these are basically histograms of the demands and the actual ransoms paid for various attacks. So the typical cost of defending a ransomware attack is around $100,000, but it's really heavy-tailed. It can go up several orders of magnitude, up to 10 million. What's interesting here is also data exfiltration can cost a lot more, nearly 5 times as much. So for organizations, maybe $500,000 if you're really big is a drop in the bucket, and you can take that hit. But for smaller organizations, that's going to be a tough thing to pay. And that's not only the ransom, that's incident response, getting those backups, checking your system, doing the defense that needed to be done. So clearly, this is something we should be worried about. I'm not trying to be alarmist and fuddy, but this is something that's a big problem. Okay, so how do these attackers get into your system? I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework. This was this system that MITRE developed to try to understand how attackers get in your system and kind of move about within the system. 14 tactics, techniques, and procedures, and 227 overlapping sub-techniques. You can probably barely read this slide because I had to zoom out all the way to get the whole framework onto the slide. You could, of course, go to the ATT&CK website and peruse it at your leisure. But for a lot of these things, and I'm a data scientist who lives with these frameworks, whether it's vulnerability frameworks or attack frameworks, threat frameworks, The issue with these is they try to be comprehensive. They try to cover everything that could possibly fit into what attackers do within a system. And because they're that comprehensive, they're really hard to comprehend. So I, as a data scientist, I deal with this data, and I even struggle with stuff like attack. Now, this is how attackers get into your system. The difference there is there's also defend. This is a thing, again, I'm fans of attack and defend because they organize this information, but they're kind of tough to deal with. And so this is taking a lot of those MITRE attack techniques and looking at the controls that you can deploy to fight against those. And so again, we have this kind of large, comprehensive list of categories and hierarchies of things that you can do to defend yourself against various attack techniques. And it starts to get really complicated. So when I met Ed about a year ago, I was really excited that he was like, oh, don't worry, I have organized this all in a way people can actually use. And so I'm going to turn it over to him to talk about that.
Great, thank you so much. So welcome everyone. These slides will be available at RSA, so you can download it if you want to. So the Ransomware Defense Initiative, or RDI.
Sure thing.
It's a result of a research that I did about a year and a half ago. And the idea is to identify a set of controls to detect and mitigate ransomware attacks. So let me ask you a question before we continue. Phishing technique 1566 is one of the most common techniques used by attackers, correct? Who can tell me off the top of your head a control that can be used to detect or mitigate phishing attacks? Passkeys. Okay. Any more? MFA. Beautiful. All right. So you have the little worm in your ear right now. You're going to be thinking about this for a while. You're going to be thinking, what controls? RDI identifies 45 controls. I'll show you. Right. So if you go to rdishield.com, you're going to see the web app there. It looks just like this. We're going to see it in action in a little while. But it is based on MITRE attack and MITRE defend. So when I did the research, a lot of the documentation will tell you the initial attack vector, right, for all of the ransomware attacks. And it always points back to the MITRE attack initial access. And when you go to MITRE attack initial access area, it shows like 9 or 10 different techniques. I chose those 7. Those are the 7 most common use attack vectors. We know a lot of them. We're familiar with a lot of them, right? So once I identified the attack vectors, I went ahead to MITRE defend. MITRE defend already identifies what they call artifacts that are used to defend against common techniques. And this is a graphical representation of the MITRE defend countermeasures against phishing technique. That's just a few of them. There's about, if I remember correctly, 18 or 21. Keep an eye on the naming of those controls, all right? Keep an eye on that one, because we had discussions with some of my colleagues about what do we think this means. So I did that for every single of those 7 techniques and started creating a basic table, right? So the left column, the first column, is all the attack techniques, and all of the other columns are your MITRE defend artifacts or countermeasures. So I analyzed all of this and tried to make some sense out of it. And this is the first look at version 1.0 of the Ransomware Defense Initiative.
0.1.
0.1?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
alpha, right?
I don't know, I'll leave it to the data scientist to correct. So 0.1. And I was happy because, again, what I wanted to do was identify controls to detect and mitigate ransomware attacks, and I did. And I was happy. Imposter syndrome kicked in, all right? I'm like, I've done this. Is this good? I'm like, will people accept it and think this is good work? Will it be useful to the industry? Or will people just laugh at me, you're an idiot? Right? So I went to my contact and I said, what do you think? I presented this to them. And they were very encouraging. I mean, that's the reason why Dr. Data is over here with me. So I wanted to go ahead and validate this. And I started validating this with about 100 CISOs or so, CISOs in the States, in Latin America, and in Europe. And I started showing them how to use it, right? You basically select one of the columns, the well-known techniques, and you go down that column. You see a check mark, go to the left, and that's the control that applies to that technique. So right here, you can start to see, again, for example, technique 1566. You will go down this table, and you will identify 45 controls just for phishing. That's pretty good. We don't have to think about it anymore. It's a good reference. You can accept it. You don't have to accept it. So during the validation process, I took a lot of the comments, recommendations from all these CISOs, and this is version 1.0 now?
Sure.
Okay. This is the final version. So completely different from the original version, because the first one was about 90-something controls in total. And they said, this is very good, but it's very difficult to digest. How can you group the controls so it's easier to understand and to review? Some others says, Ed, if this is for detect and mitigate, how can we identify which controls are for detection, which for mitigation? So I thought that was a great idea. I went ahead and I divided it into foundational, advanced, and elite. Foundational, because I didn't want to call it basic. And for marketing, foundational works perfect. Blue is detection, red is mitigation. Let's go. So as I was showing this, validating this with the CISOs, a CISO from a large manufacturing company told me a story that his company had been a victim of a ransomware attack, right? And they hired the very well-known company to come in and investigate and do the report for them. Yeah, we know which company it is. And they explained to him how the attack begun. And this is a typical network, right? And what happened is that the attackers took control of a valid user account on a copier machine that was connected to the network. The CISO didn't know there was a copier machine. The attackers did. Yeah, so they took control of that. They moved laterally, then they were ransomed. No, leave it there. Just gotta get my water. And then, so the report told them how the attack happened. Now we can go. And what happened then is the recommendations. What the CISO did, as I was explaining to the CISO how to use the matrix, you see he went straight to the last column, technique 1078, valid user accounts. And he went down, every time he saw a box, he went to the left to identify the control. He got all the way to foundational, went to the left, and identified identity and access management, right? The report from this big company recommended that he implement identity access management. So his company will be protected from future valid account type of attacks. So he said, that's why I just validated RDI, right? As I was explaining to him how to use it, he said, I went there, went down to the left, there's IAM. And that's exactly the control that was recommended. So I was over the moon. I said, let's go. We'll release RDI. And really quickly then, RDI divided into 3 families, as I said, foundational, advanced, and elite. The first thing that you notice is the typical defense in depth, right? There's your layer defense. You start with foundational, you move to advanced, and then you end up with elite. Dynamic and evolving. So last year, very important company in the industry was attacked. And the goal of the attack was to make them, ransomware. But they stopped the attack. And I remember the report that they came out, they stopped the attack within 16 or 18 hours. I'm not going to say the name of the company, but some of you may remember who I'm talking about. And anyway, the way that the report came out is that the company had deployed a very mature role-based access controls. Role-based access controls stopped the attack before it became, a ransomware attack. I realized I didn't have role-based access controls as part of RDI. It is there right now. It's part of foundational. So it's dynamic. And then, before we go, the last one, guided progression. It's interesting because that came as the result of one of the case studies that we're going to look at in a second. But it serves as a strategic type of tool as well, which is something that I didn't envision. So once you start to use it, you're going to find different ways of using the tool. So foundational, right? Every single organization, regardless of size, needs to focus on foundational, okay? And especially if you're a small company, this is good for you, or this is good for small companies. It identifies controls that you already own, right? Host-based firewalls already comes with the operating systems, correct? Antivirus, anti-malware. Creating policies and processes. You may have to spend a few $1,000s, but we're not talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And this goes with what Wendy Nather said almost 10, 13 years ago, right? Cybersecurity under the poverty line. Yeah, this goes exactly with that. So everyone should definitely focus on foundational. Once you have a good maturity state on foundational, then you move on to the next level, which is advanced. So for example, in foundational, you have implemented 2FA. As you're growing, your company grows into mid-sized company, 2FA becomes too cumbersome, too complicated. So now you start looking at MFA is the next step, right? And then you end up with elite. And elite is not controls that you buy, turn on, and off you go. This is the culmination of your cybersecurity program. So if you're using zero trust architecture, for example, right? It means that you have strong foundational controls, right? You have security logging and monitoring, you have patch management, you have airbag and stuff like that. You have good advanced controls. You have MFA, network segmentation implemented, DLP, PAM, and so forth, right? So if you have all of those controls in foundational and advanced at a good level, you're ready there at elite level. So again, from a strategic perspective, it gets you there. Let's do a quick case. So a local government in Australia had been victim of a ransomware attack. They called the same company that did the investigation for the manufacturing company. And they recommended what they needed to do, right, to get better against ransomware attack in the future. And they wanted to know how well they were doing, how well they were progressing. They heard about RDI. They called me, we spoke. And I had the opportunity to go to Australia. It was a nice trip. And I got to work with the CIO and the different CISOs. And we use RDI. This is application is available right now for you to use, rdishield.com, free to use, right? Basically, you presented with the controls from each family. And you're asked the question, is this control installed or deployed across the organization? If the answer is yes, you will answer 4 more questions. If the answer is no, there's a gap, right? And if the answer is, I'm not sure, I think it is, but I don't know that it's everywhere, so now you identify a control of interest to go ahead and review further. So if you answer yes, I deployed it, now you answer them 4 questions. The next 4 questions map to CMMI levels 1 through 4. You can give each question a scale value between 0 and 10. And it focuses, starts first with documentation, configuration, moves into people, process, procedures, moves into maintenance, optimization, and it ends with automation. And depending on what value you give yourself, self-assessment, right? So what value you give yourself, it takes that information and it calculates in real time your maturity for that control. And it maps it to CMMI. Now, don't do what a CISO did, where he said, I don't think this is working. He said, I get high marks on all my controls, and I don't think my controls are that mature. I'm like, do you give yourself high marks when you answer those questions? Right? Garbage in, garbage out. You have to make sure that you do answer this as true as possible. So when we finish doing the assessment, there was a report similar to this, right? The CIO noticed immediately the current risk. She's like, we don't accept that risk. This is as an example. She said, we could take, our risk tolerance is about 70%, so we can assume 30% risk. This is too high for us. So go ahead and figure out what we need to do to improve this. So we immediately looked at the maturity per technique. Phishing is very low, so we wanted to focus on phishing. So we go over there where it says phishing, which identifies all of the controls that are for phishing. And we notice you have vulnerability management. Go up, previous one. Right there. So what we did, and this is where it became interesting for me, because I didn't see this as a use case for RDI. This became as a what if, and as a strategic tool, because we went straight to vulnerability management. We saw how we had scored ourselves, and we're like, what happens if we move the needle more to the right? Instead of a 6, we give ourselves an 8, right? And as we do that, this calculates automatically, right? And we did that. Now we can go to the next again. And now the risk went down, let's say, by 3%. So the CIO said, that works for me. I know in financial terms what 3% in risk reduction means to the company or to the organization. So the task was for the CISOs to come up with a strategic approach, what they need to do with vulnerability management to get it to that mature state that we selected at the end. So what we did then is we actually did a NIST CSF very focused audit on that one control, right? And we were able to create a strategic approach on how to mature that one control, what needs to be done. So that was very interesting. So now we're gonna go ahead and give it back to Ben. It's got beautiful graphics, awesome stuff here. Thanks.
All right, so I'm on a different mic, so hopefully this is going to be working well. So after Ed talked to me about this, and he showed me the RDI matrix and said, look, we can fill this all out. And I said, man, this would be great if we could understand, what people are actually deploying. He gave you a great case study, but I want to know about a bunch of organizations. Like, one is great, but I would like to know what we can answer if we knew a bunch of what controls people had deployed. Like, what are all your peers doing? And he said, well, of course, we record all the results, right? Like, we when people enter stuff on the website, and ask them. They send it to us, and we can know what controls are out there.
And before it's anonymously.
Totally anonymous. Yeah, I should.
Right, so we don't collect information, name of the company, location, nothing.
You can check the
It's
job
just-
script.
You just answer that.
Yeah.
Right, and then it's part of the survey, which helped the entire community. So
Yeah. And so we started to look at things. So I got excited. There was actually data. We're going to look at some responses, people who went to the website and filled in their controls between March 2023 and 2024. This is that version 1.0. So I don't have the cool CMMI data quite yet, but
not yet.
in the future. So we got about 1,500 responses, which is really great. That's a fairly big survey sample. As someone who does a lot of data science, mostly in the foundational controls, that's where we're going to focus today. We did have some advanced responses. I'm going to have a few results on that. And as a data scientist,
Can I say really quick?
yeah,
So one of the things that we found out is that people start getting very excited and they start going through foundational, and then at the end they're like, oh, I don't need to
I'm
move.
not that good.
I'm not going to move further to do advanced.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why they just stopped at foundational, and we don't have enough information for advanced, because you're going to see the numbers. It's kind of sobering.
yeah. So I like to start a data science project. I like to just ask some research questions that I think I can answer with the data. So before I dive in, which controls are most likely to be deployed? Which techniques are people missing the most, right? So he talked about some of the techniques with those case studies and ways that organizations got in. I'd like to know, like, how often were those outliers, or is that common? How does this compare to actual prevalence of attacker techniques? So are people deploying controls that are actually stopping things that attackers are using? And then the last one, are there kind of different security program approaches to ransomware defense? Are folks kind of taking different tacks when it comes to, I'm going to do this group versus that group, and then I get to do some kind of weird data science stuff. All right, so the first question, of course, we want to ask is just how many things are people be deploying? I think we have foundational on the top, advanced on the bottom. The horizontal axis is the number of controls somebody has actually deployed, and the vertical is just the percentage of organizations who have done that. I think the striking thing here is there's about 3% of orgs who filled out the entire survey. This is somebody who went through and clicked everything. They clicked no or yes. 3% of orgs have nothing. They're just out there flying blind, which I think is kind of, wild. Good for you. But for the most part, organizations have between 12 and 24 controls. Now, I am not a network architect. I'm not a security architect. But this is a lot, right? You can go down to the vendor floor and certainly spend a lot of money and buy 18 different controls today. But this is a lot of stuff to manage and control. So advanced has roughly the same distribution. The next question I wanted to get at is kind of, are these correlated? Do people, if they have more detection controls deployed, do they have more mitigation controls deployed? So this is kind of a two-dimensional histogram. The colors as they go through, the hotter spots, so there's more organizations there. And we can see that there is this correlation, but it was actually not as tight as I would have thought. In particular, the more detection controls you have, the more mitigation controls you have. But there does seem to be, there's people who do a lot of detection and not much mitigation, and vice versa. So there was this kind of interesting thing. We're going to touch on that a little bit later. Okay, so to that first research question, the most common foundational controls, and I meant to ask you before I got to this slide, but we'll get the reveal. So is anybody surprised that it's antivirus and anti-malware at the top? No, it's been around forever, right? I had Norton Antivirus on my Windows 95 machine. So this is really, that's table stakes. Almost 3/4 of organizations said, yeah, we've got antivirus deployed. It's surprising that 27.5% don't. Yeah, so that's a lot of folks who were not running antivirus. Down towards the bottom are also kind of non-surprises. So use security software on mobile devices. We know that this is a vector for a fair number of famous ransomware cases, but it's also like a hard thing to deploy, right? People want to use their own device within their organization. They don't want to carry two phones. They may be reluctant to deploy whatever your agent is on their phone. There are methods to do mobile device software, but more than 1/4 of organizations don't do that. And I was also kind of surprised at the spectrum here. I kind of expected it to be more tight, but from 1/4 of organizations to 3/4. All right, let's go to the next one. So advanced controls, we can do the same thing. Again, at the top, stuff that's been around for a while, intrusion detection. And then, things at the bottom, I think the one that showed up at the bottom, the software bill of materials, I talked to Alan Friedman. I'm glad he's still beating that drum out there, but I'm not surprised that organizations are reluctant to do that, right?
Yeah.
Again, it's always nice as a data scientist when I get some results and they kind of verify my priors. I mean, maybe that's not great, but it does go with my expertise, and I think a lot of people would agree this is what we'd expect as far as the distribution of which controls are actually deployed. Okay. So what techniques do they cover? And this chart is deliberately kind of boring. So if you've noticed when the ransomware, the matrix that was constructed for RDI, a lot of the controls cover multiple techniques, right? And so what happens is with a few controls deployed, you get like at least one coverage of most of everything. So this goes from like 96% of respondents, basically everybody except those 3% who had 0, are basically doing everything, right? So with a few controls, you can get most things out there. So this is really unsatisfying, right? And I don't recommend you just do the bare minimum. So I thought, well, let's get in, let's see whether those are detection techniques or mitigation techniques. And so I tried to do a breakdown also of, do you cover this tactic that attackers are using with a detection control or mitigation control? Again, fairly unsatisfying. Most organizations, around 80%, are doing it with both. They have multiple controls in place, and there's detection and mitigation controls. And then, there's some orgs that just cover it with one or the other. So Ed was talking about this idea of defense in depth, right? And looking at this risk. So I like this chart because it's pretty, but also because it illustrates that there is quite a range of values that you can have within any particular technique. So the way this chart works is across the bottom is the number of controls covering a particular technique. We see the techniques in the vertical there. And then it's colored by the percentage of responses that had at least that many, and potentially more. And so what we can see here is, again, and this is for folks who covered it at all, so that's why it starts at 99% and not the 96. Those valid accounts, for example, at the top here, almost everybody gets it covered by at least one technique, and then as we go down, we kind of see it drop off. And so there is this residual risk that you're potentially not covering, because even if you have 10 controls, which is about 2/3 of organizations, there's still other things you can deploy, other layers of defense that you can put up that can help further defend against those valid account attacks. So it does illustrate there is some variation here, of course, in Ed's example. So the last thing I wanted to look at is, are people investing correctly? So attackers certainly have preferences for different techniques, and so we should be able to look at whether the controls deployed are actually covering those techniques. So I'm going to go back again to my favorite research organization, Scientia, and they released this report with Title Cyber. They went out and collected a bunch of reports that they could find on ransomware attacks and tried to look at which ones had particular initial access techniques. And they give this ranking. And on the inscrutable attack IDs for the initial access. We have about 8 of them there. There was another report that's raining in ransomware. This is also a Scientia report. They gave actual percentages of events. This is also from the thing I talked about earlier. We're going to focus on the Title Cyber one because the results are essentially the same, and I don't like repeating myself. And so what we see is there's actually a fairly strong correlation here. It's 6 data points, but I would call it a correlation. Across the horizontal is the ranking that we saw in that list, and the vertical is the average number of controls. And so it does seem like people, valid accounts is that number 1 ranked. That tends to be well covered. The same thing with exploit on publicly facing application. People do seem to cover that the most. There isn't a ton of variation on that vertical axis, but it does seem to go down to things like supply chain compromise is pretty rare, and that's the least covered of the techniques. Now, the one outlier here, of course, is drive-by compromise. Folks deploy a lot of controls because there are a lot of controls that cover this, that mitigate against drive-by compromise, but it's actually pretty rare. Attackers don't use it that often according to the data. So that may be an opportunity where we can adjust kind of how you're deploying what controls you have and maybe focus on other areas that are not quite as well covered. All right, let's get weird in data science here. I wanted to kind of understand if the controls that folks were distributing were different, if there were different approaches to doing your security program, security architecture. So I deployed something called principal components analysis, and actually a variation of it that deals with kind of survey data like this. And what this is it actually broke up the responses into two different clusters. One with more controls and fewer controls, and ones that are kind of mitigation focused and versus detection focused. And so what we find here is that there are organizations that don't deploy a lot of controls, but they tend to be mitigation controls. And in the lower right, we have ones that are really detection focused. They have a lot of detection controls out there, and they have a lot of them. So there do seem to be this kind of separation of I'm going to do more detection and a lot of it versus I'm going to be a little bit more careful and do mitigation and less of it. I just think that's interesting that the data does kind of self-sort itself. This doesn't always happen when we look at kind of clustering like this. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ed. He's going to give you some closing remarks, and then we're happy to take questions at the end, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. So you notice that RDI is more from a proactive approach to cybersecurity, right? Not as reactive. When you look at the controls, you're not going to see controls like backup, right? Restore processes. Those are reactive. That's after the fact. This controls focus on proactive, how to detect, how to mitigate. Sorry, you're the one driving there. So for the next today and next week, visit rdishield.com. Give it a try. It's free, it's easy to use, answer a few questions, and you get information in real time, right? How those controls, what's your maturity. If you like it in the next 3 months or so, then really, really do this more focused. See if you can get a really truthful type of report of where you stand. And in the next 6 months, make it part of your cybersecurity program. For example, CISA and FBI comes up with a new report of a new ransomware family that's attacking healthcare. And they tell you they use valid account, for example, right? So what you do with RDI Shield, you already know which are the controls to deal against valid account type of technique. Go ahead and be proactive, right? Do an assessment only on those controls. And then you will know, am I okay? Am I safe against this one? Where do I need to worry? Where do I need to focus, right? Another way that CISOs are using this as part of their programs right now, if they're a new CISO to a new organization, they're sending me emails. This has been fantastic for them because they come in the first 3 or 4 weeks, they go through this with their new team, and they go through all these questions. In about 3 weeks, they get a really good idea of where their new organization stands. And they also get a very good, quick idea of the type of resources they have on their team. So it's pretty cool. So again, if you can use it in the next six months, fantastic. And I think with that, we come to the end. Go ahead. So invite you to visit rdishield.com. Give it a try. You see us around walking today. Love to talk to you some more if you have any questions. There are surveys to fill in?
Yeah, you're going to get an email to fill out a survey.
Yeah.
And subscribe. Hit
yeah.
that smash that button.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's it. Any questions that you may have? We have a lot of time. Yeah.
Do you plan to expand this to other types of threats, not just ransomware?
That's a great question. So one of our good friends, Adrian Sanabria, told me the same thing. He said, Ed, this is not just for ransomware. And I said, I know, but I cannot come up with a tool that says, hey, we do everything. And people will at that point, they'll laugh at me, right? So no, this is just focused for ransomware, but you can use it absolutely for helping you with your NIST assessments, right? Instead of focusing on 200 and something controls, do this, identify where your gaps, where you have low maturity, and just do an ECSF on those 6 or 8 controls. You don't have to pay Deloitte $250,000 for a 6-month project, just, right? It's a great question. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi. There are different control frameworks, so it is possible to map this tool with other standard or best practices like the ISO, NIST, and other frameworks?
Yeah, so that's another good question. When I did this with the Australian government, they asked me to map it to their, what's it called, top 8? What did it call it? I don't know. I forget. It's something called 8, something like that. But I started to start doing the crosswalks for some of them. And the funny thing is that there's other frameworks that are came out around the same time. One is called the Ransomware Blueprint, right? And that was created by like a group of like 6 or 8 companies with the help of CISA, I believe, right? And it came out around the same time. IST, there you go. And they do map it to the CIS top 20. So you can definitely map this to those controls, but I'm working on creating those crosswalks.
I do think I like Defend in particular because it is really specific, right? It is like this control where I think like for example the NIST categories are a little bit squishier on like what exactly you do. It's more like you should be doing X without necessarily telling you this is the device you need to do X or this is the program you need to do X. So I do like Defend in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh yes,
oh, yeah,
100%, 100%. The newer versions that are coming up, but probably in about 3 weeks to 4 weeks, it will allow you to register if you want to. And that way, when we come up with a new data in a year's time, then we can give, it's still kind of anonymous. We will not be asking for company name, but we will ask for location, size of the company, medium, small, small, medium, or large, or and location. And then what we can do is we can start showing in those reports. I give it to this guy. He'll go nuts. Imagine what type of companies, size of companies, and industry and location, what do they focus the most? That was very interesting. But yeah, it's still anonymous. All right. Oh, yeah, yeah. Excuse me?
Could you go back to the slide with the link?
Just like with the...
There's 2 microphones set up.
Yeah, just.
In the island, if you guys could ask questions into those, that would be really helpful.
I'm sorry, with the website? It's rdishield.com.
They moved it to the RSA stuff.
Oh, they did already? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. If you see me walking around or Ben, we're here. Thank you.
Thank you.